Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this Centre for Development Impact seminar. My name is Chris Barnett. We're very pleased to have Jeremy Holland here. We started trying to get Jeremy here in February, I think it was, and we've had this our third attempt. For various reasons, hasn't happened. So we're extremely pleased, and we welcome Jeremy this afternoon. A few things to mention. We are live streaming, so just be aware of that, just to make you aware of that's happening. For the online audience, and there's hashtag CDI seminar if they want to ask questions through Twitter. I think that's to make you aware. And lastly, Jeremy's book is available in the bookshop, so if any of you haven't read it yet, then straight after this seminar, there's the opportunity to go and get a copy. But rather than spend too long talking, I'll hand over to Jeremy, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Jeremy Holland, and I finally made it. As Chris said, I think it's the third attempt. There was a university strike, and then there was I was very ill, and now today there was a huge pile up on the motorway, so someone was trying to prevent this happening, but we're finally here. And it has now been, I think, about a year since this edited volume came out, which seems quite a long time, but if I tell you a little bit about the history behind this book, then actually a year is not that long, because it's taken many years to get to the point of publishing the book. Robert Chambers and I have been discussing it for a few years, and with a combination of cajoling and arm twisting on Robert's part, the book is now finally out, and we're really pleased with it. It has a collection of case study material that really spans more than 10 years worth of work on participatory statistics, some of which has been updated, and is really a very rich body of empirical reflection that I encourage people to dip into. And it reflects also the extraordinary breadth of interest in participatory statistics that there is out there amongst academics, applied researchers, NGOs, donor agencies. And it was really sort of rewarding to see how much work has been done. And over the last 10 years in particular, other people have come into the field that traditionally haven't engaged with participatory research, and that includes colleagues at the University of Reading Statistical Services Centre who understand about the statistical issues involved in research, they understand about sampling protocols, and they have an open mind to using participatory research methods. So that's been a fantastic boost to this initiative as well. I think it's fair to say that in the sort of 80s and 90s, when participatory research evolved out of community development work in the South, there wasn't that necessarily a lot of rigor in terms of generating data, because it's largely about promoting processes of local reflection and action. And also there wasn't a huge amount of self-confidence amongst the participatory research community about what participatory research could do, in terms of engaging with normative ways of generating evidence and learning. So this book is an attempt to kind of bring that forward and kind of actually make a statement to say, yes, there is a lot of work that's being done, and yes, there is a lot of promise to take this forward. So that's just by way of a kind of background. So in this presentation, I really want to just briefly run through the kind of the premise of the book. I'd like to just talk a little bit about a couple of the participatory methods that are being used and illustrate them, and then finish with just raising a few kind of methodological issues and methodological challenges that we can discuss as a group today. So with that, I will press on. So, as the title of the book suggests, this is about two things. It's about participatory processes and about generating statistics. And the premise of the book is that participatory statistics presents a win-win for development, in that it can generate statistics reliably in a timely fashion, with value for money, and at the same time can empower local people, embed local research in a process of action, particularly in a sphere of research which has been and continues to be highly extractive. Now, when we talk about a win-win, often that can seem quite trite, but I think in this case, I think it really does have a resonance. And looking at some of the more recent trends in thinking amongst practitioners, I think actually this is a very timely moment to be talking about the potential of participatory statistics. And the reason I say that is because amongst donors generally, there is now a kind of a pause in which donors are now reflecting critically on all the money they're investing in local accountability processes. So the World Bank's community-driven development agenda, which has invested hundreds of millions of dollars in local governance processes, and DFID's own accountability portfolio, which is also huge. You know, DFID spends a lot of money on grant-making mechanisms that support local accountability processes that bring service users and citizens together with policymakers and service providers to try and build accountability and improve delivery and outcomes for the poorest. Now, there's a kind of a normative ideological sort of persuasion behind those types of programs, and as tends to happen in development, you get a point at which there's a kind of a bit of a pushback, and people say, well, hold on, is this actually making any difference? And there have been a number of large-scale evaluations of these types of local processes, including Mansouri and Rao, who did a big review of the World Bank's local development program. John Gaventa and colleagues here at IDS did a large-scale 10-year meta-analysis of citizen engagement programs that came out of the Development Research Centre work that he led here, and one or two other large pieces of work which have basically concluded that at best the evidence is patchy, that this kind of governance, accountability, citizen empowerment work actually has an impact and a sustainable impact on local processes and local outcomes. You know, there are good news stories and plenty of evidence that things can really change, but generally there's perhaps quite a healthy skepticism now about, you know, what are we really trying to do, throwing a lot of money at these processes, and how can we really make that work better. And one of the colleagues in the room here, Claire Hughes from ITAD, and I are working, in fact, doing a meta-evaluation of DFID's portfolio of empowerment and accountability with precisely that in mind, trying to find out what works and why. So the reason I raise that is that because when we're talking about empowering local people, the participatory statistics approach, and it is an approach rather than a methodology, because it has the process combined with the data generation. That participatory statistics approach provides donors like DFID with a wonderful opportunity to embed the learning, adaptive programming, you know, reflective practice approach of their programs, and sustain and support and accountability mechanisms as part of that. So that the process of building in participatory statistics into accountability programming not only generates the data, but it also supports more effective and transformative change. That's the hypothesis. The other quite timely thing about this book is that there's a little bit of a swing back in the pendulum around large-scale randomized control surveys. Now, I know many of you may sort of be following these debates, which are quite kind of fruity debates online and on blogs about RCTs. And whatever you think about RCTs, they are very expensive indeed, and also they don't produce rapid, timely data. They're part of a kind of large-scale, Titanic sort of model of data generation. And looking at DFID, which is an agency that I do most of my work with, within DFID, there are elements now who are thinking, actually, when we're thinking about value for money, are these RCTs really worth our while? Are they, I mean, even assuming they can give us the kind of answers we want, is it worth spending all that money to generate that kind of data? And within country offices, particularly, there are DFID program managers who are open to alternative ways of generating data. And the participatory statistics methodology offers, for them, a sort of compromise. You can generate, and we'll come back to this later, but you can generate reliable data using, for example, cluster sampling in a smaller number of sites to generate data that can be aggregated and standardized and compared across time and over time and between populations. So for a DFID results advisor sitting in Nairobi, that has a lot of promise, given the extraordinary pressures DFID are under for value for money. So all that quite rambling elaboration of these bullet points was just to make the point that it isn't a kind of trite thing to say it's a win-win. Actually, in terms of what's happening right now, there's a very strong case for pushing forward this twin-pronged approach. I just want to briefly kind of revisit what we mean by participatory statistics. And this diagram is from Robert's paper with the same name, and it locates participatory statistics in the kind of northeast quadrant of a methodological diagram in which you have quantitative and qualitative methods and data along the x-axis, and then you have participatory new research and embedded traditional research along the other axis. So we know when we talk about embedded traditional, we're talking about questionnaire surveys that are conducted with households or with social groups, and we're talking about traditional qualitative ethnographic studies, often based on participant or direct observation and spending relatively long periods in the field. Now, when we talk about participatory research, we're talking about both quantitative and qualitative data, and I think one part of this book is to remind people that actually participatory research does generate a lot of quantitative data. It's not just sitting around chatting about what's happening. But the powerful thing for me particularly is the way that it sequences the quantitative and the qualitative, so that you generate data, you analyze and justify the data that you've generated as a group, and then you do the kind of evaluative discussion that goes with that. So you have the powerful combination of the quantitative description of change and then the qualitative explanatory causal analysis of that change. And participatory research is group-based and visual. So whereas traditional research, quantitative research, deals with individual respondents, participatory research largely deals with groups of participants who become analysts in their own right. Many of them may be illiterate and poor because participatory research is very good at reaching the poorest and the most excluded, as well as talking to a range of social groups across communities. But the visual part of the participatory research is particularly well suited to illiterate groups. So this group of elderly women, for example, in Ghana, are recipients of a cash benefit transfer, and they've been targeted because they are the very poorest of the poor. And these women are described as bottles in their community, because if you scratch them, you get nothing. These are women who have no productive members of their household, who relied previously on begging and the will sort of to put themselves in the hands of God. And the cash benefit has allowed them basically to live, and it has also enabled them to re-engage in community networks and social institutions. So that's an example of how a group-based approach can bring together excluded and voiceless members of community and allow them to analyse the impact of a programme on their lives. And many of you will be familiar with a lot of these methods, and I don't want to spend a lot of time ploughing through them, but these are the visual methods that involve mapping and modelling, a lot of listing and ranking and scoring, and diagramming. And I think it's fair to say that the numbers that are generated are both quantitative and quantified. And that's another important issue that we stress in the book. People in a community can sit and estimate and calculate based on their group recall, but they can also give a value to something that is essentially qualitative by scoring or ranking characteristics of that qualitative thing that they're looking at. So, for example, if we're talking about a group of patients who are doing a kind of an evaluation of their health clinic, they may come up with a group of qualitative characteristics linked to the accessibility, the relevance and the quality and the sustainability of that health service, which they can then score and then justify the score they give, and then evaluate how that health service has changed and how it in the past and how it can be improved in the future. So there's the quantitative data that can be generated through observation and through group recall, and then there's the quantified data that can be generated through perception scoring of qualitative changes. So an example of the first type of quantitative data is livelihoods analysis, where in this case a group of market traders estimate the proportion of women who are working in different types of occupations in their community. So that's the quantitative data that they generate through estimation, and then they qualitatively score characteristics of that livelihood based on a discussion that they have as a group. So in this case, in Malawi, a group of market traders listed the various livelihoods in their community. They used 100 seeds to estimate what proportion of their community is involved in each of those occupations. They then estimated the average monthly income, and then they scored those occupations for reliability and then overall preference, and they justified their score. So that is an example of a group scoring activity which generates estimation data and quantified data of qualitative evaluation. Wealth ranking is another example of a powerful tool for estimating, And in this case, using 100 seeds, a group of local people can estimate the kind of incidence of poverty and well-being in their community according to their own definition of what it means to be poor. So they will take 100 seeds and distribute those seeds across wealth categories that they identify, and then they'll have a conversation and a debate about have they allocated the right number of seeds to each group. And this is a process of kind of successive approximation, which Robert talks a lot about, where a group, by kind of cross-checking each other and challenging each other, can come up with an accurate estimation according to their own criteria of how many people are in different poverty categories in their community. And on the basis of that, you can then talk about how a particular program or project intervention has changed that distribution of well-being, whether people have moved in and out of different categories and why. So you can have the kind of evaluative discussion that feeds out of that. So in this case, a group in Ghana allocated seeds according to different well-being categories, and then they discussed to what extent the cash transfer program had targeted the poorest in their community. Was it well targeted? And also in what way poverty had changed as a result of that cash transfer. So a lot of you will have seen this type of kind of wealth ranking outputs, where you have a wealth category, you estimate the proportion of the percentage of people in each wealth category, you list the characteristics of people in each category. And that can form a very important starting point for trying to understand social difference and then explore and explain changes and contribution to change of a particular program. And I'll just do one more illustration for you. This is household income and expenditure analysis. Again, as part of this is a 6-country study we're doing on the impact of cash transfers on local household economy and local economies. And we were trying to understand from beneficiaries' perspective, in what way had the cash transfer changed their spending, their income and their spending. It's trying to understand how it had enabled them to make choices which previously they may not have had, particularly with regards to investing in productive assets and diversifying livelihoods. Now, this we experimented a little bit with, we moved away slightly from the group-based estimation, because we wanted to generate individual data points. In other words, we wanted to build into this methodology something more akin to a survey, a household survey, which has individual respondents. Why did we want to do that? Because we wanted to generate data with a randomly selected group of participants, which had the individual data for each of those participants on their income and expenditure, but which also allowed those participants to mutually kind of interrogate each other and challenge each other and discuss how things had changed for them. So the power of the group analysis was kept, but at the same time we tried to introduce individual data collection to allow us to get this win-win situation where we could extract and aggregate data on beneficiary income and spending. And not only that, but by having, for example, a 10% sample of beneficiary data on income and expenditure, we were able then to demonstrate that particular changes of behavior in a community were representative of the beneficiaries as a whole. By that I mean that if you go into a community as a qualitative researcher and you're trying to look at the impact of a program on that community, quite often you will look for an exaggerated outcome, or something that's not that is beyond the average experience. It's an unusual outcome, but it's more interesting, exciting, and maybe reinforces your own preconceived notion of what's changed in that community. So for example, in this case, I was working with a kind of overexcited anthropologist from New York who ran around the community looking for exciting, dynamic changes amongst the beneficiaries to prove the hypothesis that this cash transfer didn't just stop people dying, it actually enabled them to become entrepreneurs generating a diverse and sustainable income from that cash transfer, which is a small, predictable, regular transfer of money. So she came up with in one community, she found two middle-aged women who were a little bit, they were probably towards the wealthy end of the beneficiary category. So they were probably, it might have been what they call an inclusion error, where you get people who shouldn't really be beneficiaries receiving the cash transfer. And these resourceful middle-aged women had pooled their cash transfer and started up a motorcycle taxi business. Now, these women were dubbed by my anthropologist colleague the motorcycle mamas. Yeah, the motorcycle mamas, doing this amazing entrepreneurial activity, and I was able to rein her in, in a rather boring fashion, by pointing out that the data that was generated through this income and expenditure analysis for a 10% sample of beneficiaries in that community actually showed that the typical response was that most people were able to invest in a little bit of petty trading, maybe, keep their kids or their grandkids in school, pay some of their health bills, and spend a lot more money on a better diet. But for the most part, people weren't investing a lot of money in agricultural livelihoods, let alone the kind of small businesses that these motorcycle mamas had started off. So the point about participatory statistics in that kind of context is that if you do generate that kind of reliable data, you're basically you're demonstrating the external validity of your qualitative research, so that the people who are of a kind of empirical quantitative persuasion can't turn around and say, well, that's just got a journalistic qualitative research, how do we know that's reliable? Actually, you can show the validity of that qualitative research by saying that, okay, this in-depth case study of this woman is actually fairly typical of the kind of range of experience that we've found through this quantitative analysis. And not only that, this woman, who's a motorcycle mama, this is not typical, but actually it's quite interesting, and we might actually find something out about how in the future we can try and support something that's more innovative and entrepreneurial. But we're not saying that this is typical of the situation at the moment. So we're capturing both the typical and the more atypical type of experience, and showing where it fits within a kind of normal distribution of behavior change within that community. Okay, so that income and expenditure data for the individuals can then be plotted, and you can compare across communities, because even though you have local groups generating their own categories of income and expenditure, you can standardize to a certain extent to allow that aggregation and comparison. And that's something that involves having standardized categories that can be allocated to quantitative data. And it's not always appropriate to try and compare across populations and over time things that are essentially highly contextual. And an example of that, I think, is from the early 90s, when the World Bank was doing participatory poverty assessments. A lot of those PPAs used wealth ranking, and they came up with the categories that I talked about, and and people estimated the distribution of well-being across those categories. And then one of the program manager for that, sort of legendary program manager for the PPA, then decided to aggregate those categories, aggregate the data across communities, and compared that to the official income poverty data, and found that actually remarkably, it was very similar. So actually, aren't these participatory methods wonderful? Because they're generating data that is actually very similar to the money metric poverty data that's generated as part of national survey data. And that's dangerous and misleading, because in that case, the well-being analysis is highly contextual. What one group in one community just means by a rich person or a medium person or a poor person is not the same as what another group in another community means. So you can't aggregate and compare in that way. So we need to remember that when we're talking about participatory statistics, we're not necessarily saying that all participatory statistics can be aggregated and generalized above the level of that context. But there are ways in which you can combine locally identified categories of change with categories that can be that are standardized and comparable. How are we doing? I mean, that leads me to this last slide, which is really to try and raise and bring together some of these issues that I've been talking about, and perhaps something that we can then discuss as a group. So based on this range of case studies in the book, we are making a claim that participatory statistics can accommodate both participatory process and data extraction. Now, we know, those of us who do participatory research know that in many cases the research we do, yes, uses participatory methods, but we'll be stretching it to say this is actually a participatory process. You know, in terms of good practice, we would insist on sharing our findings in a community meeting at the end of the period that we're in that community, and trying to trigger a reflective discussion about what it means to that community. Within individual group discussions, we would do the same thing. What does this analysis mean for you as a group with your own social identity, and what can you do about it? So in that sense, there are some sort of process elements built in, but often there is a lack of time and a lack of resources to embed participatory research in something that's more meaningful and more sustained. One example of something that we're trying to do, which is more process-based, is with a couple of colleagues here from IDS, working with IFAD to do with a participatory impact assessment process, looking at the impact of IFAD's programs across its portfolio, and trying to build in the time to bring local decision makers into that process of reflection at different levels, and really trying to kind of inject meaningful participation into that process. But it's not easy, and it takes a lot of time and effort. So that first kind of hypothesis or premise is something that can quite easily be challenged, and we need to think carefully about that. The second point is the one that I've been making, which I think I would say this can be done. This isn't a problem. You know, we can accommodate contextual participatory research, and we can include research that generates externally valid data. And the two key things that we need to do are to have a sampling protocol that allows us to involve participants who are randomly selected in some cases, but also a hierarchical sampling procedure where you're showing exactly how you sample communities in particular districts, so that you're introducing a little bit more rigor into the sampling protocol for your participatory research. And the other element is to encourage participants to generate categories in their own context, and then over a period of time, through a piloting process, emerges a small set of core standardized categories or indicators that can be then used with participants in different sites over the course of the research. So you're accommodating both contextually relevant, locally driven analysis, but also including some standardized data collection. The third premise is that, as I said earlier, is that participatory statistics can do both quantitative data collection based on observation, estimation, recall, but they can also accommodate very powerfully quantification of different types of qualitative change. And one of the most powerful examples in the book is the work by Dee Jupp in Bangladesh, where she has worked with a group, a social movement in Bangladesh, to encourage them and facilitate their analysis of their own empowerment process through their involvement in this community mobilization process, which is essentially a group of landless peasants who claim their right to government land, which is for the most part expropriated by kind of powerful land grabbers, and with the backing of kind of legal middle-class Bangladeshi NGO workers, they've been able to claim their rights to land previously denied them. And in the course of one generation, their children are now not just going to school, but they're going to college. They have 2 cropping seasons, a massive diversity of livelihoods. The women are now involved in community politics, and many of those women were, through their social and caste position, highly excluded previously. It's an extraordinary transformative process that movement has documented and analysed itself, and is doing so on a regular basis. And it's something that's a really powerful example of how participatory research can mobilise and allow groups to collectively reflect. And the point about merging analysis and evaluation, I think I've made that clear. Often with randomized control trials and large-scale surveys, you get data that describes a bivariate relationship, and then makes some claims to causality. And then you spend an hour poring over the data to try and see whether how much confidence do we have in this data. And then the qualitative, evaluative stuff comes from the sort of the discussion with the taxi driver on the way to the airport. So this participatory research, for me, perhaps the most powerful thing for me is the way that it combines the quantitative and the qualitative. It's quite extraordinary. And it does so in a way that provides the kind of real-time feedback that outsiders, program managers, really need now, in which developments in information technologies and social media have allowed for this real-time feedback process, which has left the large-scale survey trailing in its wake. And that's something that really gives an extra impetus to using these types of methods and processes. And then the final point was the one I made about the motorcycle mamas. With participatory statistics, we can really kind of be confident about the extent to which our qualitative insight and evaluation is representative of the population we're looking at, because we're generating statistics which show the distribution of behaviour amongst that group. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for listening, and hopefully we can get stuck into some of these issues. Thanks. Let's
We've got time now for questions. We might have to use the mic being live streamed. We'll take group back to the three, and give Jeremy time to kind of think about them and respond. So, any volunteers for some questions, some initial questions, observations, comments? One from Richard.
Yes, I'm Richard Longhurst, a Research Associate at IDS. Is there any scope for mixing participatory and non-participatory statistics, or is it a matter of, you know, being pregnant? You're either pregnant or you're not. I'm just wondering if in terms of resources, when you're in a tightly constrained resource situation, there's some scope for mixing methods profitably, or at least following the adage that, you know, the best is the enemy of the good.
Hi, I'm Rebecca. I just have a quick question about the group exercises that you were doing, where you were getting people to put kind of seeds in groups. I was wondering what the advantage of doing that as a group exercise was over once you derived categories, you know, maybe in a group, getting individuals to rank things. Because if you do analysis at an individual level, you know, you get, say, 10 data points for a group, and then you can get the mean and the standard deviation. Whereas if you get people to decide in a group, maybe one person insists that it has to be this way and everybody else just agrees. What do you think the difference in the methodology is, and how does that affect your data?
Thanks. Just to follow up on Richard's question about mixing methods, just from experience, I was working with Jeremy Swift in Mongolia in the 90s on livestock marketing research, and we did exactly that, mixed methods. We did wealth ranking and all sorts of participatory exercises for prioritizing, for assessing different market channels and so on. But one of the fascinating things with mixing the methods, we also used the wealth ranking cards. We used cards for households or GARE holds, camp holds, and that became a sampling frame. So we had the card game to, you know, randomize the samples. It was just doing statistics in more appropriate ways. It was actually still quite extractive, but it was a lot more fun, and it was a lot more reliable because we got critiqued back, both on the, I mean, everything you mentioned about cross-checking each other, different groups doing wealth ranking in parallel to get an average that then checks out the outliers and so on. It's just a much more thorough way and thoroughly more enjoyable way, but it's still extractive. So I was wondering, yes, I mean our colleagues at the institute, the Veterinary Research Institute or the Agricultural Economics Institutes in Ulaanbaatar, who are working with us, they may pick up some of the methods, because we could see the statistics and the correlations were actually a lot more reliable with the wealth ranking data compared to the household or GARE data we went out to then collect. The combination allowed us to check hypotheses and test hypotheses, but the basic data was much stronger in general, and you could generalize it more because it was easier to collect. But looking at it's still extractive, and there's still a power situation, and after we've left and how that data then gets collected within the institutional context of the statistics office or the Institute of Agricultural Economics, obviously it's beyond your control after you've left, and I'm just wondering whether the methods per se have any empowerment. Methods don't empower people. People empower people with methods. These are these are probably more appropriate methods to do it with. But anyway, sorry for that ramble.
Okay, thank you. If anyone else wants to jump in and answer these questions, please feel free. I'll have a first go. On the mixing data question, absolutely. I mean, I don't think there's any sense of kind of methodological privilege or purism involved here. At one level, it's very much about what works best, and mixing group-based research and analysis with individual survey data, often typically a sort of a mini village or urban survey, has worked very well, as well as relying on data from larger surveys. So, I mean, I think the simple answer from my side on that is that there is the issue of mixing data that isn't an issue. In terms of the group versus the individual, I think a lot of this comes down to what Carlos Barahona at Reading, University of Reading, a social statistician, he talks about public versus private data. So there's some data that can be collected by a group because that group has sufficient knowledge of the data to be collected that they can collect it together very efficiently. And one example in the book is Carlos and Ruth Levy's work in Malawi, where they worked with a sample of communities to estimate, firstly to do a sort of a social mapping exercise where they categorized all the households in their villages according to their food security status. And that was a standardized category of food security that could then be used across all the sites. And that was based on the fact that a small group of people sitting in a village knew every household in their village and knew exactly the food security status of that household. So that was a way of essentially doing a census map of a whole village across a sufficiently well-sampled number of sites, which allows you then to make very powerful, confident inferences about how well a targeted inputs, agricultural targeted inputs program in Malawi was reaching those most food insecure households. That research not only showed that there were some problems with targeting based on that social mapping categorization, but it also was so well designed that they were able to estimate the population of Malawi, of rural Malawi, as being, I think, 25% larger than in the official census. So they were able, just to show you that this is a rigorous sampling procedure, which was so rigorous that actually they were able to estimate the population of rural Malawi, and they discovered that the official census had underestimated it for political reasons, I think, by some 3 million. So in some cases, where you're trying to collect private data, which is related to a particular individual's experience with, for example, a service, or where you're trying to get data that, for an extractive purpose that is not publicly known, then what I tried to do and illustrate was that we worked with public and private, so we encouraged individuals to do their own individual income and expenditure analysis. Now that could have been done through a survey, and some people would argue that by doing it in an open group session, it would encourage people it would create bias because people might not be totally transparent about how much they're earning and what they're spending their money on. Having said that, it's notoriously difficult to get income and expenditure analysis through good data through surveys, and you could argue that by having a socially stratified group of participants, in this case a group of beneficiaries who have a similar social background and common understanding, that would encourage greater transparency and honesty, if you like, in terms of the kind of analysis that each of those individuals do. The point that Carlos Barahona makes, who is the statistical guru that we always look to, is that you have to just be, when you write up a methodology, you have to be very transparent about how you do things and the assumptions that you make as part of that. And this is just good practice in any field of research, and something that participatory research hasn't been very good at doing. So people can be sort of skeptical about participatory poverty assessments because they come up with findings that it's not clear how they arrived at that particular participant, and that particular participant's voice was amplified in that report. You know, so it's all about being more rigorous and transparent in the way that you do this kind of methodology. The sampling frame issue is an excellent one, and it's mentioned in the book, using that kind of census mapping approach to get a sampling frame from which you can then do a random sample, a small-scale survey, something like that. Methods don't empower people, absolutely, and that's I think that's the most difficult thing that we're trying to deal with in participatory research. You know, there are good examples of how group-based work can empower people, and the Reflect methodology perhaps is one of the most kind of impressive in the way that it encourages groups, for example, indigenous and low-caste women in rural Nepal who sit and reflect on the basis of their disempowerment and exclusion, and then try and take action to do something about it and challenge people who are holders of power. Now, that is part of a process which is very, very clearly motivated by social justice and social change, whereas a lot of the research that's done is motivated primarily by the desire to get some data out. You know, so that's the tension and the trade-off that we're dealing with all the time. You know, as long as you embed participatory research in a process which has transformative aims, then the methods can be part of a process of empowering people. Alex Shankland at the back and I are working on an evaluation of a DFID accountability program in Mozambique, and that is looking at using this kind of local analysis and feedback to transform relationships between citizens and service providers in health and education in rural Mozambique. And in that case, that is the very program is designed around the platforms that are created for this kind of supply side and demand side interaction around service provision. So the data that's generated in terms of group scoring of service quality, accessibility and relevance, that data feeds into that process of engagement and accountability. That is an example of how the data can serve both purposes, because that data then can also be used for monitoring, evaluation, adaptive programming, and an external evaluation. Anyone else want to jump in?
Got Alex at the back.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. Actually, I was going to talk about Mozambique, but I won't now because you have. But I do want to ask you about analysis, which you flagged, right, and which is one of the key, if not the key area where power comes into play, because it's the construction of the narrative about what does all this mean. And I want to ask you, what does, in relation to other forms of participatory research which generate, if you like, more purely qualitative data, you know, you do one of the things we do in Mozambique, you do an institutional mapping, and then you say, why has this important actor, this ministry or whatever, featured as so distant from us? Why are they inaccessible? Why are they unresponsive? And there's no numbers involved there. But you're constructing a narrative which can or may not lead to political action. What difference does it make when you're discussing numbers? Given that statistics is a language that we are often much more conversant with, the meaning making around numbers and the variations in patterns of numbers is often more part of our habitus and the habitus of the bureaucrats with whom we're often working than it is of the people generating the statistics in the first place. Are there other things you need to think about? Are there experiences you can share or lessons you've learned in how the particularity of generating numbers through these processes as opposed to other kinds of data can feed into a more powerful analysis process?
My name is Saurabh Arora. I'm from Spru here across the road. My question is sort of related to the last point made by about the interpretation of numbers. So numbers might be understood differently in different parts of the world. For example, let me give you a very simple, straightforward thing. As children in India, where I grew up, we count 12 on one hand, 1, 2, 3. Whereas here, you know, my kid who goes to school here counts 5 on one hand, and I try to teach him, no, there's 12 on one hand, not 5. but he, of course, is embedded in a different system. So 2 or 3, the ranking of 2 or 3 might mean very differently in Kenya and then in Ghana. So the generalizability that you talked about, that, hey, this is not just context specific, there is a combination with generalized standard categories possible. But then, even if some categories might be generalizable or standardizable, are the meanings of numbers generalizable and standardizable?
Just now, I heard you mention about the behavior change reflected by participatory statistics. So I would like to maybe have more elaborations on this and how it can be done in more details and how it can be representative and realize external validity. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, the habitus of numbers. This is a good point, and I've got a couple of examples which for me leave me in no doubt that generating numbers as a group deepens analysis and encourages, really forces, yeah, it deepens the analysis. So an example, a group of ghetto youth and police officers in in downtown Kingston, Jamaica, sitting together, scoring the quality of their relationship. Okay, that the scoring, the numbers themselves are not particularly useful in an extractive sense. You know, there was an attempt to kind of try and do some longitudinal data collection around it, but the scoring process was what really kicked off the debate. You know, and of course, the police realised that the police realised that the young people were scared of them, and the young people realised that the police were scared of them. You know, and they were able to talk about it, but the scoring process really deepened that analysis. I have no doubt about that. Okay. Another example is the community well-being, the wealth ranking. The arguments and the debates around allocating those seeds across well-being categories, you know, that really deepens the analysis for me. Forcing people to give a score for their perception of the quality of a service, and I'll come to this issue of, you know, number context in a minute. You know, that sparks off extraordinary debates about, you know, why are you giving it that? So for me, that the numbers as a kind of a motivator for deeper diagnostic and evaluative discussion is no doubt there. You know, and of course, you can do different types of qualitative analysis, the kind of power analysis that IDS has been working on, the institutional mapping. You know, that's all part of it. And for me, the qualitative and the quantitative go hand in hand. So that would be a case for that. Yeah, I think in terms of the meaning of numbers and the fact that in different contexts people use numbers in have different understandings of what numbers mean is a good point. But I don't think we need to get hung up on it. You know, I mean, you can as long as you design these things contextually, you know, you can then, with a bit of common sense, you can still aggregate across communities, even with slightly different scales. You know, I don't think, for me, that's an interesting point, but it's not a kind of deal breaker. But happy to be challenged again on that. And then this issue of behavioural change, and I think perhaps we can talk more about that. But certainly, by building in a sampling protocol which allows you to generate, for example, a 10% sample of the population you're working with, and then doing individual data collection with that population along with group-based discussion, you're then establishing the range of behavior change, in this case around income and expenditure. So you can actually see what the typical experience is, and then be confident that the qualitative analysis is actually capturing the typical experience in that community. So, and the external validity in that case would be relevant to that cluster sample, but then if you have a sampling methodology in which you're capturing data from a larger number of sites, then the external validity expands based on the amount of data you feel it's appropriate to collect for extractive purposes in terms of producing valid data. So probably to be continued, but I think the point that's made in the book is that we don't, although we acknowledge and respect the fact that different types of methods can collect data more efficiently, participatory methods can do more than was previously claimed for them. That with some careful design, they don't have to be just contextual data collection methods. They can be part of a methodology which allows for aggregation and generalization.
Can I supplement with three points which have arisen? The first one about numbers. It's absolutely fascinating. If you dictate to people what numbers they should use, things may get stuck. I'll give you an anecdote from Bangladesh, where my colleagues were facilitating matrix scoring of different varieties of paddy, and it was taking ages, and it was really badly stuck. They were asking people to score out of three seeds. And so then we said, well, what would you like to score out of? And they said 16. And as soon as they went to 16, it went like a bomb, because they were able to make the fine discriminations that they wanted to make, which they couldn't do. It's a bit like marking term papers. So that was the thing on numbers. I mean, I think things ask people what numbers they want to score out of. That can be done. The second thing is about empowerment. I think, as you said, Jeremy, in the book, I think there are good examples of this. One example, and Alex, you might know about this from the Amazon, but I've been told that participatory GIS has been used very widely by indigenous communities in the Amazon to map their land, to establish their rights, and then they have GIS maps which they can use to empower them with authority. Is that right?
There's two relatively well-known examples, one from the northwest, one from the southwest.
Another example which also links, it's both empowerment and its behavior changes, is this one which you mentioned, Jeremy, which is called Measuring Empowerment, Ask Them, Quantifying Qualitative Outcomes from People's Own Analysis. And these are these groups in Bangladesh who meet to score social change with a large number of indicators. And when they do that, it affects their own perceptions and their own behavior. And they do this for things like gender relations and relations within the family and relations with authority. And so they score these and they see how they've been changing over time. So it is in fact it's both empowering them in relation to authorities because they're gaining confidence and understanding, and it's also a catalyst for social change. Changes in gender relations over the past 10 years, analyzed using the 10 seed technique. Absolutely fascinating. Men and women coming out with different answers and then debating between them and agreeing agreeing on final scores, that itself is a huge intervention in terms of their awareness and their relationships.
Are there any other questions or observations?
Sorry, just two points about numbers. I find that these last conversations really fascinating about the, what do the numbers mean and how the relativity of it and so on. And my first point about the question about whether the methods and power and so on, and working with the statisticians in Mongolia, in that work, the overriding conclusion for me was that the participatory numbers were much more reliable, but the numbers have a power in their own, especially in the hands, in the register of the statisticians. And when we did the household surveys, it became so obvious how unreliable a lot of the statistics were, and the official statistics, and how you have to look at the life cycle, the life history of a number to understand what it actually means. And often it means very little. But it's in the use of the numbers where it becomes interesting. And actually the numbers themselves, although they take on a power and a mystical existence of their own in certain registers, in the use of they can be very kind of transparent. You talked about that, but and one of the highlights of my experimenting with the participatory methods in that experience in Mongolia was working with a particular nomad herder about scoring different marketing channels, and we went through long explorations of seasonality, of the different kinds of criteria for marketing channels that they came up with, the two of them, and we went to weighted matrix ranking, scoring, if you like, of these channels. But then they educated me and said, but you're not understanding this because you're only looking at these criteria, but it matters whether it's sheep or goat or cattle. Meat is not the same. So they helped me come up with we call it double weighted matrix rankings, and other people have done it, I'm sure too. But it was just a whole other level of sophistication in using those numbers, not the numbers, but in thinking numerically and relatively about that, and getting an education as to what goes on inside the head of a nomadic herder in terms of their livelihood. And that was the fascinating part, actually, the use and understanding that it's not a case of they are not numerate, they're extremely numerate, they're a lot more numerate than I am about the business they're in, and it's just getting an insight into the various dimensions that they take into consideration in those calculations. And the outcomes were different when we did one matrix ranking using one set of weighted criteria, and then we went on to the double weighted, because it took account of more of the different considerations that they were making in their calculations. So yeah, the whole question about numeracy is itself really fragile, because it's not a straightforward case on measuring numbers on an absolute scale on one dimension. Is kind of, it's using that as a language to get into a conversation about what matters, possibly.
If there's no other question, I've got one. It relates to what you said about participatory statistics can very well remain an extractive process in the end. And I was wondering whether, with your experience looking across different participatory statistics, interventions or research. Do you think there's a case to be made for a stronger ethics around that issue?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, just on the issue of learning. Well, this principle of learning reversal, which you've been elaborating on, I think that's a really important element in participatory statistics, as well as in participatory research generally, and I think that means that you have to have a long build-in time to designing participatory research methods which allow for that learning reversal to feed in, so that rather than turning up in a community with a predefined set of questions as you would with standardized research, you're understanding and learning to the point where you can then develop an instrument that's going to capture relevant, meaningful data. So I think that's a really good example. And then the final point was on ethics. Yeah, I mean we had a group, participatory statistics group, for a few years, which met, and we came up with a code of conduct, and that should be on the IDS website, but I don't think it is. I'm not sure. Yeah. I wrote a kind of long, quite boring code of conduct, and Robert sort of just cut it down into a pithy. I mean, basically, there is a code of conduct out there which directly addresses a lot of these issues and tries to build in sort of minimum good practice, particularly around statistics, which have their own set of ethical challenges, which I think are more demanding on us in terms of ethics than perhaps participatory research more generally, because of this issue of standardization and going for more breadth over depth to capture sufficient population sample sizes, and also looking for random samples in addition to purposively selected groups. So those kinds of issues are tackled in the code of conduct, but I think it's high time that we revisited it and refreshed it, because we haven't really. I certainly haven't gone back to that for a while now. So yeah.
Revive that group.
Well, why not? Yeah.
Well, I mean, we met at sort of 2 or 3 month intervals in 6 different centres, didn't we? I mean, we met in Swansea, in IDS, at ODI or IID in London, in Reading, and a couple of other places. And it was a very active group for about 2 or 3 years. And Reading picked it up. They ran courses in participatory statistics, but there wasn't enough demand, so they had to stop. They had an 8-day course. They ran about 3 or 4 times, which Carlos Barahona and his colleagues ran. And they had a website, and that website is useless now. I mean, excuse me, Carlos, if you're watching, but but I mean, they've abandoned the website for participatory statistics. So as far as I know, there isn't one anywhere in the world, and it's a real shame. I mean, it's a real gap that there should be an active group somewhere that's really pursuing this and making things available. It's maybe, I don't know, you impact guys here, perhaps you can do something.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Jeremy, very much. It's great to have you here. I think been made aware of there's a huge wealth of experience that you've drawn on from 10 years, but also in this room and beyond. And there probably is a lot of questions about what next and where to go next that we should follow up after this event. So thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Jeremy.